I'm going to present a paper, preliminary results of a paper on the redistributive effects of taxes and benefits on income distribution in a selection of European countries and MENA countries. The background of this analysis, so basically I think there can be two starting points. The first starting point is the one on which we have already learned a lot this morning in the keynote by Chico Ferreira, is about the pattern of inequality. At least we can say that we observe an increasing inequality in income and wealth in many OECD countries, in industrialized countries. At the same time, if we look at this week cover of The Economist, we read about the inequality illusions, why wealth and income gaps are not what they appear. And so there is an important issue here. And the message I take home is basically that it's really important to have and to use comparable data and to have a proper and cross-country analysis of this data. The second starting point is about the contribution of the public intervention, either on the side of tax revenues or on the side of benefits on income distributions. The tax benefit systems shape the level of inequality of both pre-tax benefit income due to incentives and distortions, but also shape the level of inequality of post-tax, post-benefit income through the redistributive outcome of these policies. And what we observe in terms of high shares of top incomes and wealth income ratio raise a challenging issue about the overall structure of inequality, about the structure of capital taxation, and more generally redistribution policies. We observed over the past decades that top tax rates on income diminished mostly everywhere, that there is a little contribution of wealth taxes to revenues, and generally there is also a growing provision of means-tested and universal benefits. But if we take all of this together, I'm not completely sure if we have to take for granted basically that conventional tax policy analysis is completely or at least partially wrong, as seems to be one of the conclusion or provocation included in the latest book by Emmanuel Saez and Zuckman. Again, it's important to have a proper analysis of this phenomenon, and a cross-country analysis, I think, very often helps to understand the mechanism behind the redistributive outcomes. So in a nutshell, this paper basically was to test the feasibility of an analysis of the redistributive effects of tax and benefit policies in the selection of countries based on the LIS ERF data. There are important and seminal contributions on the topic based on LIS data, pioneered by Tony Atkinson and colleagues in the middle of the 90s, and more recently in the European Union, the availability of both USILC data and HFCS data, which also include information on financial and non-financial assets, combined with the development of the EU-wide microsimulation model called Euromod, contributed to a growing literature on the effects of income taxes and social benefits, but also of taxes on wealth. So the detailed aims of this paper can be basically three. First, to analyze, to explore the prospects for using the new ERF data as the underlying micro-database for assessing the redistributive impact of taxes and benefits in the MENA countries. Second, to compare the income distribution in the two sides of the Mediterranean and also the effectiveness in the redistributive process of the most important policy instruments and taxes. And third, to test the feasibility of this database to be used as input data for a tax benefit microsimulation model, such as Euromod SouthMod, in a sense, a model that started covering all European countries, but that recently went south, including countries from Africa and Latin America. And this would allow to analyze the redistributive effects of detailed tax benefit policies currently in place or hypothetical. Of course, there is plenty of challenging issues stemming from consistency and comparability of results across countries. relate to the level of details of the analysis, which often are constrained due to the differences in the underlying national dataset and tax benefit policies. And another important caveat is a little knowledge of main economies and tax benefit policies, and this refers to me, basically. So I learned a lot working, and I learned a lot 2 days. So selection of countries, basically, I initially started with the country really on the 2 sides of the Mediterranean, included in the ERF and in the LIS data, but then looking at all countries included in the release of the ERF data, these include also some which are not really Mediterranean countries, so I went also a bit north and east in terms of European countries. So at the end, the selection of countries included in this analysis is a bit dodgy in a sense, but at least it includes the 4 major economies of the European Union and all the ERF countries. Another important caveat is that my analysis is biased. In a sense, it provides sort of a Eurocentric approach. So this acts as a caveat also as an apology. But in a sense, the classification and analysis of tax benefit policies follows the established tradition in the European countries. This is the same relate to the measurement of income distribution and redistribution. So for instance, I use and I apply the modified OECD equivalence scale to equalize income, as this is the most used in European countries or also officially by Eurostat. And as, again, when we look at poverty, for instance, we measure it as it is traditionally done in European countries, so considering a relative poverty and assessed against the poverty line set at 60% of median equalized income. Having these caveats in mind, let's have a look at the countries that we included in the analysis. So in this graph on the left, we have the 10 countries from the north side of the Mediterranean Sea, and then the other countries from the south side. And here we have the gross domestic product expressed in per capita and according to the and expressed in PP related to 2016. Of course, we see huge differences across the 2 groups of countries, but also within the groups of across countries. Something important, so there are differences across groups, but some of the countries in the MENA group or in this group of countries show a per capita GDP which is not that far from some European countries. This is a first point. Second, if we then look at the macro aggregates related to the public intervention, and here we have a measure of public revenues expressed as GDP in 2016, again, clear differences across groups. In European countries, we observe public revenues between 30 and 40–45% of GDP, much lower in the MENA countries. But if we look, for instance, at the role of taxes on income and profits, so basically personal income tax, we see that these play a quite relevant role in the European countries, up to 12–13% of GDP. But also in some MENA countries, these are quite important and they play a role. So we see that in some countries, so Egypt, Tunisia and Israel up to 10% of GDP. Then there is, again, a caveat in this data from the IMF. For the MENA countries, the social contribution are not shown, while in some countries these do exist. So the issue of comparability of data does not refer only to micro data, but also to macro aggregates. If you look at the other side, so public expenses, the story is the same. Important difference across a group, but again, if we look at the social benefits, so the expenses to pay basically transfers or cash benefits to individuals and families, also in the MENA countries, in some of them reaches important figures. So this leaves me with the idea that it's important to look at the redistributive effects of taxes and benefit. In order to do that, also in these countries, in order to do that, we need data. And we use the ERF-LIS data for this country. And without looking at the detail, I think that an important question mark to consider about comparability is when we look at the nature of income data. They can be either gross or net or a mix of the two. And indeed, across countries, the situation is quite different. So, I mean, it's not so easy to take this microdata and to consider the variable income. What is in that variable? And if we look at a bit more in detail, we would like to have all the green ticks where the different columns, the first one is the disposable income, then the different component of original or market income, so labor, capital, private transfer, then the benefit side, pension and other social benefits, and then taxes and contributions. So we would like to have all green ticks. In this sense, it means that all the different income components are included in the dataset. But we see that this is not the case. This basically is the case for 5 out of 10 European countries. And this is the case for 2 countries, Israel and Jordan. In other cases, the situation is more complex. In the European countries, basically, we do not have information on taxes and contributions, while the different income sources are already collected net of taxes and contributions. So that means that we have a measure of disposable income, but we do not have a measure of taxes. This is the case also in some MENA countries like Iraq and to some extent Egypt and Sudan. But in these 2 countries, the difference is that we do not have information neither on pension and social benefits. So again, the measure that if we just take the data, the measure that we can consider disposable income is something different, because basically is market income net of taxes, but does not include pension and social benefit. So it's quite challenging to have a comparable measure, and as long as we look at the details and look at the different components, this of course becomes more complex. Why we would like to have all components? Because we are interested in the redistributive process, which means we start from market income, which is the sum of employment, self-employment, income from investment and property, and private transfers. We would like to add public pensions, and then we would like to add public social benefits, so family, health-related, unemployment, social assistance, housing benefits, or cash benefits. Then we would need to subtract the social insurance contribution and the personal taxes to get disposable income. So ideally, we would like to follow this redistributive process. In terms of methodology, just to understand then the data that I will show you, the monetary values have been adjusted to 2016 prices by using the national per capita GDP growth in order to have the same year across countries. When we look at the average values, we converted into purchasing power standards using the PPP indexes for GDP. And then, as I already mentioned, we equivalized this income data using the OECD modified equivalence scale. Okay. When we look at the income concept, then market income means pre-tax, pre-benefit income, then we add the public pension, and then we subtract taxes. The redistributive effect is simply defined as the difference in Gini of market income minus Gini of disposable income. And then we look also at the effect of benefits on poverty, so to look at the anti-poverty effects of benefit. Something just to compare micro and macro data, the The blue line represents the average equivalized income, so the per capita equivalized income, here expressed in monthly amounts. And again, we see basically the picture that we saw earlier relate to the GDP. So more or less the same pattern. But then when we take the ratio between the GDP and income, this raises a number of issues with a ratio which is almost constant in European countries, while it shows important irregularities in the MENAs. Some are explained by the nature of these economies, others I think requires scrutiny of the data. For instance, the PPP for Iraq, at least the one I got from World Bank, I have problems to use them in relation with the income data included in the data. If we look at the income composition, which is a first step to look at the redistributive effect, here we consider all households, and we express basically the different income component as a share of disposable income. So we see that the largest share is represented by labor income, but in some countries, in European countries, where we have access to information on taxes, we see that taxes are an important share, so they represent between 20 and 35% of disposable income, and also the benefits are a relevant share. In the MENA countries, so in Israel and Jordan, where we do have information on taxes, these are important, 20% of GDP in Israel, much less important in Jordan. But there are other important aspects that emerge. For instance, the importance of private transfers in Jordan and Egypt, and the importance of capital income in Iraq. Of course, the picture changes substantially if we look at the bottom decile group. Again, I would like just to focus on the set of countries for which we do have information. And in the bottom, then we can see that the importance of taxes reduces a lot, while then we have the cash benefits that play an important role. And this is true in Israel and Jordan as well. At the top of the distribution, as expected, the income taxes are more relevant, while the effect of cash benefits, of course, is less relevant. If we take all of these together, instead of looking at the decile group, we want to have a measure of the redistributive effect, as I said, looking at the Gini index of market income as a starting point. So this is the blue marks here. What we observe is a Gini of market incomes which is much lower in the MENA countries than in the European countries, at the same time a much lower redistributive effect, even with just focus on the two sets of countries where we have information. And if then we look at the redistributive effects in absolute terms, so the absolute reduction of Gini by taxes and benefits and public pensions, we see a very important role of public pensions in the European countries, less relevant in Israel and Jordan, with an important role played by taxes. Last point relate to the effect of taxes and benefits, in particular here the effect of benefits on poverty. In this histogram, the blue bar basically represents the poverty rate, as I said, expressed as 60% of poverty line. This is the overall population. And with the red one, we will see which would be the poverty without benefits, without cash transfers. And we see that in European countries, then basically poverty would even double in the UK, so a country is characterized by quite strong means-tested benefit, while in other countries the anti-poverty effect of benefit, of course, is much less. For instance, if we take the example of Italy, the cash benefits, basically excluding pensions, do not have almost an anti-poverty effect. In Israel and Jordan, again, the poverty, and in the rest of the MENA countries, the poverty is higher than European countries, and the role of benefit is much less. The same pattern we can observe if we just focus on children or on elderly. Having said that, I think it's important to recognize the importance of the analysis of taxes and benefit, but also the importance of data set. And the way to do this is to analyze the potentiality then of a micro-simulation model based on this data, because with a model we could simulate information which are missing in the data, like social contribution, tax liabilities and their components, but also cash benefit entitlements. The model would allow to macro-validate this figure against external aggregates, to document the tax benefit system, and also then, at the end, to enhance data comparability, and then allowing detailed analysis. Very briefly, the data which are needed for a model basically are the requirements are satisfied, according to our opinion, by the ERF-LIS data in terms of household and family relations, in terms of social demographic characteristics, and in terms of individual income information, which needs to be at individual level. So looking at the information included in the personal file, I finished, in the personal file, basically we do have information, either net or gross, but with a micro-simulation model, we can recover gross from net or vice versa. And in this sense, what we have already done in other countries, starting from the European countries, but then, as I said, going south, including countries, a set of countries from Africa and South America, we have, over the past 20 years, implemented and developed the micro-simulation models that in a comparable ways allows this analysis. So we leave this as a future research prospects. Conclusions. There is a relative importance of public-state intervention, which to some extent justify the analysis of the redistributive impact of taxes and benefits. There is a problem, of course, of data comparability, but this problem holds also for the EU. So if we look at the analysis of done on list data, including all countries, including in the list, then there are problems of comparability, because sometimes we just refer to income, but is disposable, is market, so it's really important to look at the detail. And then focusing on the MENA countries, there is also a question about a new, a different welfare state typology that perhaps is emerging but is not yet fully analyzed. Thanks a lot.